My segment tonight is about welfare fraud, and it is the reliable boogeyman anytime even a meager expansion of benefits is proposed. It's part of a broader way of conceptualizing the needy in America. We conceptualize them as entitled, undeserving, or duplicitous. And this has long been used as a racist dog whistle, conjuring to mind the infamous and misunderstood welfare queen Linda Taylor, who did so much more broad criminal activity, including kidnapping, than welfare fraud. But the image of her became a specter, haunting anybody asking for benefits for the poor. She became emblematic of those that were undeserving and grifting a system. And that racist stereotype ended up eclipsing the actual horrific things that she did, often to people of color and communities of color. But nonetheless, when we talk about welfare in America, what we hear is the familiar refrain of conservative, centrist concern trolls. What about the con men, the bad actors who are spoiling this for everyone and running up the cost? Now, fraud should be a concern, but we don't hear this raised when, say, $21 trillion is lost by the Pentagon due to unexplained accounting errors. If that's not fraud, I don't know what is. When the military needs more money, fraud and entitlement are hardly mentioned, despite this revealing bit of information from an article by Reuters. Quote, some employees of the Defense Finance and Accounting Services, or DFAS, which handles a wide range of Defense Department accounting services, referred sardonically to preparation of the Army's year-end statements as, quote, the grand plug, Armstrong said. Plug is accounting jargon for inserting made-up numbers. But we're not going to call that fraud. This is orders of magnitude more money than your typical welfare fraud, but let's put that aside. The other key issue with conceptualizing the problem of welfare fraud is that we have a misunderstood notion of the purpose of the welfare state. I'll let friend of the show, Matt Brunig, explain.
The fundamental purpose of the welfare state is not to redistribute from the rich to the poor. That's not what those aren't the relevant groups that you need to be thinking about. The real purpose of the welfare state is to redistribute to non-workers. That's really the whole game. We're trying to get money to people who don't work. And I think people shy away from this a little bit because that seems to be quite an offensive thing to throw out. People are like, what? Money to people who don't work? No, what? They should work. What we should get them working. What you should, if you don't work, you shouldn't get paid, etc. Right? No money for lazy people. You know, like that. That's where people go with it. And even on the left, you see this to some degree because people will be like, we should just get people who aren't working, get them into work, get them jobs.
As Matt goes on to explain, there's only really two ways of making money in the market. The first is through ownership of capital. The second is through being paid wages as a worker. If you are in the group of people that can't work or own capital, there is no way for you to get money. And without money, you will die. And jobs don't just provide us with access to the money we need to live, they are also a gateway to other essential resources like healthcare and retirement benefits. Welfare is specifically for those who cannot get money or benefits through work. It is meant to make sure those people who are primarily children, the disabled, and the elderly don't die in a system that gives them no other means to live. Let's take a closer look at those groups. Here's some figures from the People's Policy Project. We can see that of non-workers, the majority are children. Second to them are the elderly, disabled, and then there are groups like students and caregivers who are doing a kind of work that's not rewarded by the market. Then you have the unemployed, non-elderly, retired, and other. So let's turn back to fraud. Fraud is the boogeyman used at its mildest to create barriers to receiving assistance, and at its worst to ending it altogether. Let's look at this story on food stamp fraud from CNBC.
It is the main federal food assistance program, paying out more than $60 billion a year. But attorney Todd Spodek says food stamps are riddled with fraud.
It's an epidemic.
Total numbers on food stamp fraud are hard to come by, but the Agriculture Department, which runs the program, says 6.8% of payments are in error, either too much or too little. Some 40 million Americans rely on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, what's commonly known as food stamps. For many, it's the difference between surviving and going hungry. But that's not always the case. In a story told in The Next American Greed, fundamentalist Mormon sect leader Lyle Jeffs admits he ran a $2 million scam, forcing followers to funnel their SNAP benefits to the church and to him.
Literally, we were starving.
But most SNAP fraud is smaller scale, like recipients fudging their applications or retailers selling items that aren't covered.
Anytime you have a public welfare system where millions of dollars are at their disposal, someone's going to be creative enough to try to find a loophole.
The Trump administration says its plan could save $2.5 billion a year, but critics say the program works well for its size and the changes would cut off millions of the truly needy. Scott Cohn, CNBC's American Greed.
This scaremongering about fraud, putting aside the Mormon fraudster who forced his parishioners to go hungry so that he could get $2 million in food stamps benefits, is nothing new. We are being told by this segment that food stamp fraud is an epidemic, happening, it is implied, around 6.8% of the time. But this is a deliberate misrepresentation of the data, since some of those errors are underpayments, not overpayments. And according to the USDA, over 99% of those receiving SNAP benefits are eligible, and payment accuracy was 96.2% in 2011, a historic high. But this kind of logic has been used to degrade these programs. And because these programs serve the most vulnerable, measures to curb fraud usually target the most vulnerable. These stories drum up support for gatekeeping mechanisms and means testing that make it harder for regular people to access desperately needed benefits. In the case of food stamps, 76% of recipients are households with children. And unfortunately, in the US, when given the choice between cutting down on fraud or feeding children, politicians have picked the latter. Take, for instance, Reagan's $1.5 billion cut of school lunch funds, funds that are specifically targeted at a group of people who, by their very definition, cannot work, kids.
I stated a moment ago our intention to keep the school breakfast and lunch programs for those in true need. But by cutting back on meals for children of families who can afford to pay, the savings will be $1.6 billion in fiscal year 1982.
Unsurprisingly, after that cut, child poverty rates increased, and other welfare cuts by Reagan made them continue to rise. Here's Reagan on the rationale for those cuts.
All in all, nearly $216 billion worth of programs providing help for tens of millions of Americans will be fully funded. But government will not continue to subsidize individuals or particular business interests where real need cannot be demonstrated.
So the idea was thrust millions of children into poverty because some children didn't have a real need for food, because some children's families, or their parents rather, couldn't demonstrate a real need. And therefore, it's unfair and unnecessary to provide all children, or most children, or some children with subsidized lunches. This was, of course, part of a broader process of retrenchment and austerity that has been consistent in every administration since Reagan. But let's imagine for a second that fraud is a real problem. We have already seen that it's overstated. We've already seen that these benefits are already targeted towards people who have no means to live since they are not in the labor market. And we've seen far worse and more egregious fraud in other areas of the US government. But let's imagine fraud's a problem nonetheless. Is fraud more of an issue than children starving? Is fraud more of an issue than elderly people becoming homeless because of their inability to afford housing? Is it more of an issue than disabled people having higher rates of poverty than those without a disability? To be very clear here, yes, we need higher wages for working people, but we also need to stop viewing work as the only way to receive what is necessary to live. We will always have those who cannot work. We need them in our society. Obviously, we need children, elderly people. Obviously, we shouldn't consign people to suffering because a disability leaves them unable to work. We need programs that make sure there isn't a crack for those people to fall through. That requires that the left be very clear about who welfare is for and why it exists. That requires that we combat the idea of rampant welfare fraud, but also that we essentially say, who cares? On balance, it is better to enable millions of people to thrive than have a few quote unquote bad actors. On balance, it is better than consigning millions to poverty so that a few people don't take advantage of the system.
Well said. The statistics about, the Pentagon's
Yeah.
extreme exorbitant
Speaking
waste
of taxes.
money. Speaking of taxes, no, I mean, that's exactly what I thought of because, again, to go back to something that, some of the Tea Partiers were complaining about, like the waste and the fraud in the system, like in a weird way, they're right. It's there.
Mhm.
It's just not what they think it
Mhm.
is. That's the first thing I thought about when you showed those Pentagon numbers. And I think that you're absolutely right that it's ridiculous to kind of concentrate on these small instances of fraud, even if it were actually happening. Who the fuck cares?
Yeah. Does that mean we have to just say, okay, sorry, children, you're not going to eat? All children?
Right.
Or sorry, every disabled person? No, we're not going to give you like housing assistance. I mean, it's an unbelievable trade-off. And if we were, rather than doing the kind of fiscal math, and I still don't think fraud is a huge, huge issue in terms of running up the government budget, but rather than doing that, if we thought about the benefit to society by having happy people, well cared for people, children who are taken care of and fed. Yeah. I actually want to run this clip that I found. I didn't integrate it into my segment, but I was looking up statistics on child hunger, and I want to run this and talk to you about it a little bit before we go to the reads.
My mother always taught me to let the little ones eat first, and I'm in the middle.
Yeah, me too. I make sure my brother and sister eat first.
What I like about breakfast is that you can rely on the breakfast being here, not it being gone, and not being too late.
So aside from just how heartbreaking it is to see these kids talk about letting their younger siblings eat when they don't have enough food, at the end of the clip, it says, every child deserves breakfast. No, every child needs food to live. We don't have to double down on the narrative that in order to have food to live, you need to deserve it.
Right.
We are entitled to our lives.
Right. It kind of reminds me of one reason why I've never been crazy about privilege discourse, whether it's talking about white privilege, so to speak, or class privilege or whatever. And part of the reason is because I feel like so often when people are talking about privilege, they're actually just talking about rights, and we should call it that,
Yes. Yeah.
And so again, to go back to what you're saying about the kids, does every child deserve breakfast? I mean, in a kind of general sense, yeah, of course, but it's not because they are innocent or pure or did something right or whatever, or go to school or whatever. They're just a human being, and they are entitled to food. And actually, I think that was something that was really powerful about Bernie Sanders' campaign, and also just his rhetoric, that he always seemed to presume that everybody is entitled to a decent life, right? And I think that absolutely cuts against what we've seen with the last several decades of austerity politics, as you pointed out, basically from Reagan onward. And I think that also cuts against some of the rhetoric surrounding things like work requirements, right? Which is what Clinton famously attached to welfare in the 90s, basically in order to gut welfare.
Yep. And that was one of Reagan's, policy points as well. So I watched an hour of him talking about welfare. Yeah, not a huge amount of difference between how they treated the poor. And a lot of it does play into whether or not it is derived from, right? And it is derived from neoliberal politics that don't care about human life. But the narrative used to justify it is like, some people deserve this and some people don't. And the people that don't deserve this are taking advantage of the people that do. And that's something that we have to crush, at every possible turn.
I mean, when, listening to you talk about the different ways in which various administrations have tried to bring up this idea of fraud, whether it be for welfare, food stamps, or whatever, and then also thinking about work requirements, like work requirements never actually got people to go back to work. They're just extremely punitive. And the whole point was to strangle the system, introduce all of these administrative burdens, and try to kick as many people off welfare as possible. I feel like the same thing is going on with all of the talk around fraud. No, like those people don't actually care that somebody's taking advantage of the system somewhere. Or I mean, maybe they do care, but I'm sure they also know that that's like, it's so small.
Tiny amount. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's an accounting, that's a rounding error for the Pentagon. Let's put it that way.
Exactly.
Yeah. And these, you're absolutely right. These things are meant to discourage people by creating, an amount of government surveillance that's humiliating, an amount of paperwork that is impossible to keep up with. And then kicking people off of welfare for supposed fraud that's actually computer errors, or that's just a generated response that you get every time you apply. So you have to do it over and over and over and over again. I think I did a segment about this with Medicare, and people have died. People have died because of this, waiting for the right paperwork, or their, they get to like amend their paperwork or refile, or, they end up essentially being trapped in a years-long process of trying to just get basic needs met.
Right. And then, to circle back to basically what we brought up at the beginning of the show and many other shows, that just further undermines trust in our various institutions, in the government. Obviously, when the government makes these programs extremely difficult to access and massively punitive and surveils you, you're not going to want to trust the government in other areas of life either.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And, the other kind of form of welfare fraud, if we want to call it that, is just massive companies relying on welfare to plug the gap between the below poverty rate wages that they pay their workers, and those workers need to continue to live.
Right.
And that's, been focused on, I think, very well, especially, in the Bernie campaign. I didn't mean to mention Bernie too, but going after targeting Starbucks, targeting Walmart, targeting Target. Saying you need to be paying your employees a living wage. But still, we still need to disaggregate other benefits from the wage, I think. We need to say that your right to health care is a right.
Right.
Regardless of your wage or where you're working. Your right to retire is a right. Your right to vacation. All of it. Yeah.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.